the hard part is often like when anxiety like wins per se, right? Is what we'll end up doing is we're prioritizing what feels good in the short term, usually that like relief of that fear or that anxiety that's there, but it's not leading us towards what it is that we really truly wanted, the big picture of things. Versus, you know, when we're doing the hard thing, it often is uncomfortable in the short term. Whether it's like public speaking or having a hard conversation, but in the end, it's taking us more towards that like type of relationship that we want or the type of person that we want to be. So with working through anxiety, a lot of it is like finding those ways to like make sense of what's happening for yourself, regulate it kind of within your body, nervous system, that sort of thing. And then building up the capacity to do the damn hard thing, right? Because the more that we let that short-term comfort win, the more distant we get from like the things that we really want.
All right, welcome back, Wellness Ninjas, to another episode of the Wellness Dojo podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Craik, and today I'm very excited to have the founder of Tizzy Psychology, Kathryn. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, are you excited to be here?
Yes, excited and slightly nervous.
Yeah, perfect. That's the perfect combination.
Yeah, I'm sure it's very typical for fresh podcast guests. So.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to have you here. Before we get deep into the conversation of Tizzy and anxiety and all these things, why don't you tell my audience just a little bit about you and what you do?
Cool. Yeah. So my name is Kathryn Claessens-Patrino. I'm a registered psychologist in Calgary, Alberta. Professionally, I opened my own private practice in October of 2024, but I've been working for, I think this is my 5th year kind of in the field. I like love my job. I like to try to have fun like outside of it too and have some of that balance and stuff. But yeah, I'm like very fortunate to be like deeply passionate about the work that I do. So yeah. Yeah,
I imagine that's something that you really have to be passionate about it, because I imagine that there's some like hard days.
Totally. I feel like therapy is one of those professions. It's often like a calling in certain ways. Like I think most people I've talk to, or I like listened to some episodes of your podcast and stuff, and everyone's like, yes, it's since a young age, like I knew this is what I wanted to do. So yeah, I can't imagine like doing anything different really.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I love it. So let's talk about the name Tizzy. I love that. It's like so fun. We were kind of talking about that when we had coffee. Tell us about Tizzy. Like, where does the name come from?
Yeah. So when I was like naming my practice, like a big thing for me is like I just very much value being like a real human being like with my clients, and just like authenticity is the name of the game. And I try to really like embody that like in my personal life and in my business. And, you know, when I was thinking about different names and stuff, like a lot of therapy practices are very like grounded, kind of like calm terms. And it doesn't resonate kind of with like, I don't know, my personality and what I was going for. So, while we were brainstorming, my partner actually came up with the name. But I have learned to refer to my anxious moments as like when I'm in a tizzy. So he said Tizzy Psychology, and I was like, oh, that's like perfect. And it felt a little bit vulnerable because it was encapsulating like something that was like a really personal part of my own life experience. But, again, that authenticity is what I try to embody. So I leaned into it, and yeah, it just felt like a good fit. It was a little weird, which we love. So yeah.
It's so funny too, because I was just talking to somebody the other day and they mentioned being in a tizzy.
Did they? I love that.
So I was like, yes. It's like, I love that.
It's so good. It's like such a fun feeling when I'm like sitting with clients like in a session and they will say, yeah, I was in such a tizzy like this week, or it just like fits into sessions well. It just is like neat because I don't know. I think for me, like the term tizzy has been like a really like a more playful way of like claiming or reclaiming, I guess, my anxiety, and it not feeling like this pathologized like piece. So it's kind of neat to see when that like catches on too. But
yeah,
cool.
That's cool. And you mentioned it's something you've wanted to do for quite a while. Is there like specific things that come to mind in terms of why you felt pulled to this career path?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of therapists, we can call us kind of like wounded healers. Like we've usually been through our own challenges in life, or like had family members who've struggled with mental health and stuff like that. So I think for me growing up, I was like an only child and just like very close dynamic with your parents when you're the only kid. So I kind of just found it very natural to be like a support for my parents, which, retrospectively has had some like challenges for me as well. But I just always found it intuitive to like understand like how people think in different perspectives. And it just kind of feels like who I am to my core. So it's really cool that I can like have a job that's like who I am,
Yeah. That's awesome. I agree too. I've felt that even in my career of wellness and martial arts and coaching and that type of thing. It's like you just feel this like pull, this like intuitive pull almost. And even at times when I've thought about maybe going and doing something else when things get tough or something, it's like you just always feel pulled back to wanting to help people. Right?
Totally. Yeah. Well, when I was in my undergrad, like I struggled so much because I was undiagnosed ADHD at that point in time and didn't have the grades to get into like the honors program and was basically told like, you're never going to be a therapist. And I was like, okay. And my grades weren't that bad, but so I actually went, I did a year of business to try something different and ended up like volunteering in all the like psych kind of counseling, peer support related things and was like, this is the only option. And then here we are. So
yeah, well, good for you to get here.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about Tizzy and anxiety. I want to talk a little. I think anxiety is something that is still a little bit misunderstood by a lot of people. Is that something that you see in your practice as well?
I think so. I work a lot with men, so I think sometimes even labeling something as anxiety, they'll be like, "Oh, I feel bad" or "I feel stressed," but there's sometimes like resistance around the world, and often like I talk to a lot of very like high functioning people. So when it's not manifesting in panic attacks or that visceral like worry that's maybe as observable, people have a hard time recognizing like, hey, like people pleasing or like perfectionism are forms of anxiety in a lot of cases like as well. So I think when you think of anxiety, like what do you think of? Like what's kind of that picture?
For me, I think of feelings like within my body for the most part. Is like that's how I start to recognize it in the most part. But it's kind of challenging to differentiate sometimes. It's so easy to just jump to like, oh, I'm feeling anxious. And I've learned to kind of take a step back from that a little bit and try and go, am I feeling anxious or am I stressed or am I feeling overwhelmed? Because I think there's a difference, but it's hard to differentiate that. So I'm curious, how would you differentiate where the line is? If like, is this anxiety? Is this me feeling overwhelmed? Are they the same thing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities like between the two experiences. Like even in the body, they, feel like just like that activation, like your heart racing, that kind of thing. When I think of anxiety, I would say it's something that's like very like forward thinking focus. So it's like what's going to happen, try to control outcomes, and usually will extend beyond the situation that caused it. So I find with stress, it's like, oh, I'm stressed about this meeting, but then the meeting's done and you're like, okay, did the damn thing, we're good. But with anxiety, it'll be, lingering and kind of showing up in maybe other areas of life as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like it starts to impact a little bit of like your relationships and those types of things too.
Yeah, totally. And I think with like, yes, it's just maybe a higher level of those things too, right? Like stress and feeling overwhelmed are like really, really normal parts of life. But when it's like, taking over and you don't feel like you can really be your authentic self in those moments as easily, or it's hard to be present, I guess, is another piece of it, then I'd say that's
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And another thing for me that it's popped up as is like I like sleep. It starts to impact my sleep cycles and stuff. Yeah. It's like it's now getting into that time, that like rested period of my life where now I'm thinking about things at bedtime and I'm like I can't stop and I'm worrying and like those types of things come up. Yeah. That's when I know I'm like, okay, this is anxiety now.
Yeah, you can't like shut it off kind of, right? And like appetite's another one I know for me if I'm feeling anxious, like no desire to like eat food and those sorts of things. And I always say like our basic needs are such a good place to look at how they're being impacted, and also a good place to start in terms of like self-care, right? Like going back to like, hey, how am I sleeping? How can I work on that? Eating, that sort of thing. Moving your body. Yeah.
Finding ways to kind of cope with it and stuff. Yeah. What do you think are some of the things that are like most misunderstood about it?
I think so. What you had said was like you feel a lot of things in your body. I think the hard part is a lot of people really struggle to feel things in their body. So often like that skill that you seem to be quite good at is something that I'll have to work with clients around about being more aware of kind of what they're feeling. In terms of like the misconception side of things. I don't know, actually. I think it's hard because I'm like so in it every day, like in terms of like what the general public would maybe like not understand about it. I think maybe one piece is that when people have like anxious thought patterns, often they'll recognize that they aren't totally grounded in like logic, and they'll have a lot of conflict between like two different pieces of themselves. But I know there's sometimes a stereotype around people who are like anxious is that they believe maybe everything that they're anxious about and like, you know, like live in that version of reality. And I know the duality that can kind of exist within us with anxiety can often be the biggest part of the problem. And yeah, it depends kind of what area of life too. But I think at the end of the day, people who are anxious just want to kind of control things that are beyond their control.
Yeah.
But yeah, tricky question to answer.
Honestly. Yeah, no, I know you did good. Yeah, I know. I've found through talking to people and even through my own experience, like I remember, like I never used to think that I had anxiety until I learned about anxiety.
Yeah.
And then when I learned about it, I was like, oh shit, this is anxiety. Like I'm dealing with this too, right? And then from that awareness, I started to recognize it almost popping up more. And it created this weird thing in my mind where I was like, so if I never learned about it, would I like, I don't know if I like would be better at ignoring it, or like eventually it would pop up to the surface kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of people who don't even recognize that they have anxiety, or they would say like, oh, I don't have anxiety, like I just deal with my life and move on and stuff. And I'm curious, like I think there's a risk to that, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I think I mentioned earlier people pleasing and like perfectionism, right? I think, you know, yeah, I work with a lot of kind of like high achieving like professionals as well. And I think when you like, for example, with work, right, being really worried about how you're sending certain emails or how you're carrying yourself in meetings, or having a hard time receiving feedback, right? A lot of these things people will tie it to, you know, I just have high standards for myself. But it can often be that anxiety piece that's really at the root of it, right? Like having a hard time sitting in that feeling of like not being good enough that we're kind of running away from. But yeah, I was kind of the same as you with my anxiety. Like I really didn't like that label and resisted it for a long time, which is why, yeah, Tizzy is so special to me, because it was a way of feeling like I could admit that I had anxiety, or like sit in that experience without it feeling stigmatizing sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for men too, sometimes it can be really difficult to like acknowledge like, hey, I have anxiety, because there's a lot of, I don't know, stoicism emotionally, I think, with a lot of guys.
Yeah. It feels like a weakness almost, or like a flaw.
Yeah. It's going to be like hard to embrace when it feels like you're coming face to face with a version of you that doesn't feel as comfortable maybe to look at too.
Yeah. I'm curious why you struggled to kind of find that as well in your life.
I think I've always been someone who like likes to take care of other people and focus on like their needs, which was rooted in a lot of my own anxieties. So this idea of admitting that, you know, I had my own stuff kind of going on under the surface was tricky, right? Because it's so much easier to just focus externally and be there for people and be like, no, I'm fine. Like everything's good, you know, just working hard, like achieving, all these other things. But to like sit in this experience of like, for me, it was vulnerability and a fear of like not being good enough that was at the root of things. And that was just so conflicting with like how I was trying to show up maybe in certain parts of my life, that admitting that maybe I didn't feel as good as I was presenting was an uncomfortable kind of reality to like sit with, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's powerful. No, that's powerful. I was just going to say. Yeah.
And I think in like relationships and stuff too, I think like as a woman, this idea of being like needy, right? So like needing like, whether it's like reassurance or just like talking about your feelings, I had a resistance to like having needs almost a little bit, which, yeah, again, admitting that was tricky. So
yeah. No, a dynamic that I've started to pick up on in kind of society and in just like, I guess, men and women is like women kind of tend to have this fear of being like too much in that sense, whereas like men have almost the opposite thing of like never being enough, right? And I think both of those things create these like high levels of anxiety, right?
Yeah. And I think those two things are very much like two sides of the same coin, right? Like if we keep everything in, right, we're trying to give as much as possible give as much as possible and be like a certain version of ourselves, right? But then if we're exposing those vulnerabilities, that's where then the fear of too much kind of can kick in a little bit. But I do totally agree with that. I think like for women, it's like, you know, we feel like our emotions are at the surface and expressing what we need. It's, if that's not met in a certain way, it can almost be like, oh, well, I'm the problem, I'm too much, right? And I think for guys, yeah, opening up and showing those vulnerabilities, right, which often we've been taught to perceive as weakness, I wouldn't say that they are, can be really, really scary, especially in a society that doesn't always like create a ton of space for male vulnerability in the same way that it maybe does for women.
Mm-hmm. What is the power in kind of recognizing something like anxiety and almost naming it?
I think so. A big thing that I like talk about with anxiety or any emotion really is acceptance. So when we are like resisting something that's within us or something that's there, a very normal human experience, like feelings, right? It creates tension. Like, you know, those like finger trap things. It's kind of like that. The harder you try to like pull out of it, the more you get stuck, versus when you can kind of like lean into it and make space for it. That's where we, you know, can heal. So I think being able to acknowledge like the different pieces of who you are and the complexities of it, creates space for self-acceptance, which is such a huge part of working through these things. So yeah, and I think when I say anxiety, like, you know, you can have like a diagnosis of anxiety, but to me it's more of like an experience. So yeah, I'd say self-acceptance and just self-understanding is like a huge part of the journey. So
yeah, I know it has been for me. I know, like I mentioned before, I went through a period where I was like, I didn't even recognize that I had anxiety. And then once I started to understand anxiety more and learn about it more, then I started to see it showing up more. But with that, then I was able to slowly start to take control back of it a little bit, or at least recognize it in a sense of I wasn't thinking anymore like, what's wrong with me? I was able to say like, oh, nothing's wrong with me. This is just my anxiety now that is trying to like latch onto this thought. Yes. And it's trying to stir it up and it's trying to take me to that place. Yeah. And even just through recognizing that is, I felt a lot more in control, or at least I let it kind of just like be there. And it wasn't like, because anxiety for me anyways has been like this thing where it's like, it starts, and then when you start worrying more about it, it's like now it got what it wanted, and now it's like reeling you in kind of, and it keeps pulling you further and further. Yeah. Whereas when I was able to just recognize it and just be like, oh yeah, that's just my anxiety trying to make me feel anxious again. It's trying to make me worry about all these things. Then I could kind of just let it be. And I almost got to just continue living my life while it was happening.
Totally. It's like it's like you have different parts of your brain, right? When we view ourselves as the anxiety, like we identify with it, it's harder to work through. And another piece of what I'm hearing you say is like the autopilot mode that we kind of live in, right? And when we can bring awareness to these things and kind of get out of autopilot, it can be really healing. And I think our anxiety, it's more like having a different type of relationship with it, right? Like when it pops up, it's like, oh, like here's this thing, right? That's taking me down this road, and finding that sense of agency in terms of like how much we want to listen to it or how much power we want it to have. And again, we can't like totally control it, but it's more like bringing awareness to the fact that it's there and like, you know, responding intentionally, I guess, and self-compassion as well of like, yeah, being kind to ourselves in those moments.
Yeah, we have to learn. It's a learned skill, right? To kind of learn to be kind to yourself, to learn to give yourself grace and space to feel those things as well. How do people start to kind of develop that skill set of even just sitting with their shit in a sense? Like, because it is a skill, right? It's not automatic to a lot of people. We just want to brush it away and push it down.
Yeah, totally. I like what you said earlier about trying to understand like what's under the anxiety too. I think that's a big piece. So I mean, first piece would be like getting off of autopilot and kind of recognizing like, hey, like what's happening internally for me? Like what am I experiencing? Part of that journey is like, okay, like where did this kind of stem from? Maybe like what's, you know, the trigger in the moment, or what maybe set this off if there is something. Sometimes anxiety is not that simple. And then it's like, yeah, what's the narrative that's like tied to this, and just breaking down like the journey that we're kind of on and the story that we're telling ourselves in those moments of like internal tension. And then once we do that, it's like, okay, how am I, you know, making this reflect on my self-worth right now? And self-compassion, like, it's not about being like always like super nice and positive about everything. It's about just like being realistic and also allowing yourself to like be a human too. So it's not necessarily like, oh, I'm great at everything and everything's amazing, but, you know, more so like, hey, how can I allow myself to be imperfect, and shifting your inner narrative to that, I guess. So it's kind of like how you talk to a friend. Like the cliche therapist thing to say is like, would you say this to a friend, or what would you say to a friend in this situation?
Yeah.
And even if you're struggling, to be nice to yourself, right? Like how can you be kind to yourself about why that's really difficult? Like maybe it means that you care a lot about a relationship, or that you care a lot about your success, and that says something beautiful about you, right?
Yeah, I'm a parent, and I always now will go back to like, as I catch myself with thoughts or just like not giving myself enough grace on certain things or not being patient with myself, I will often think to myself, like, the way that I'm approaching this to myself, is this how I would approach it towards my kids? Right? Like if my daughter was struggling with what I'm struggling with right now, like what would I say to her? What would I expect of her? That type of thing. And that tends to shift me back into reality a little bit of, because there's this concept too, and I want to talk a little bit about relationships, and you mentioned like having good friends around you and that type of thing. But there's this concept, I think it's Matthew Hussey, I think. You know him?
Yeah. I've seen his YouTube channel.
Yeah, so he had this, I heard him talking about, imagine if you were given this person, and you're like, this is your person, and you have to take care of this person for the rest of your life, like how you would approach that. Like that's essentially what happens when we have kids, right? This is like, this person comes into the world and you're like, oh my God, this is a lot of pressure. Like I have to take care of this person, but you will do anything. You will die for this person. You will do anything to make this person happy. And he has this idea that, that's exactly what happens when you're born. It's like the universe, God, whatever you believe in, is giving you this person, which is you. It's like, you are the only person who can take care of this person. How will you do it?
Yeah.
Right. And that's when I heard that, I was like, well, that's a really powerful image. Of like, yeah, we are the only people who can take care of ourselves, really, at the end of the day.
Totally.
It's a lot of responsibility.
It is. And I think like the longest lasting relationship that we will ever have is the one that we have with ourselves. And we're so often focused on, how we show up for other people and in an external kind of world. But the most consistent thing is, how do you treat yourself? How do you talk to yourself? How do you meet your own needs? And I think in relationships, it can be really easy to focus on like, is this other person meeting my needs, as opposed to, how am I showing up for myself? But I love like that reference to like parenting and how it can like kind of help shift your mindset, right? And open you up to how we speak to those more vulnerable parts of ourselves, and which are often younger parts of ourselves, right? Like anxiety often doesn't stem from just what's happening right now. It's often coming from like past experiences that we've had that have shaped how we see the world, how safe we feel in it, how we view ourselves, all of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, so powerful. But then relationships are also very powerful in terms of like, who do you have in your circle? Who do you have in partnership in life and stuff like that? Because those things do impact how you show up for yourself and how you manage and deal with your stresses, your anxieties, your depressions, all those types of things. So can you speak to that a little bit, even just like the importance of having good people and kind of what type of people should you have in your corner to help you with that?
Totally. Yeah. Just to jump back to like kind of past work experience I have. So my first kind of go at counseling was through the mustard seed. So I was working with a lot of like more vulnerable populations. And I mean, it's interesting because you can't fix a lot of things that are going on, in these people's lives. But the biggest thing was like having community and people around them. So I found often in those sessions, like sitting there, I couldn't, remedy the way that society's like disadvantaged them, but just simply listening to their experiences that I couldn't control was very, very healing for them. And I think that's where, relationships are so huge, is it's just having people to bear witness to your experience in life and to show up in those moments, whether they're the good or the tricky ones. And I think the other thing you asked was in terms of like types of relationships and what to look for. I think people who are willing to hold space for your vulnerability is like extremely, extremely powerful. It's often a very challenging part of relationships because someone's vulnerability can often make you feel vulnerable, and holding space for both of those is tricky. But I think that's a big one. People who are in your corner when things are going well is also a great sign, like that celebrate, your wins with you. But, every relationship is probably going to also meet different needs. Like if we're talking, platonic, romantic, all of these things, like no one can be your everything. So, for me, it's like having certain friends that I go to with certain things in life. And of course, you'll have some that are, more well-rounded than others. But and I also think those people that you feel authentic with, that's a good sign, right? Like when you just can be yourself and it's not, you're not as activated, although anxiety is not always that easy. But I think, those people that, like you for you, and you don't have to put that mask on, that's often a good sign. Again, anxiety can be a barrier to that a bit, but
yeah, no, that's interesting, because I know like people will show up in let's say romantic relationships with different attachment styles even.
Totally.
And those can come from a variety of different things and experiences that have gone on in somebody's life. Can people show up to each other? Like, can like somebody who's like very anxiously attached show up with somebody who is like very like avoidant attachment style?
Yeah, I think they're definitely tricky dynamics to navigate. Like, there's definitely a pull between like the anxious and the avoidance. They love to find each other when it comes to dating. I totally think that you can make these relationships work. The big thing, though, is it is contingent on both people who are willing to be aware of their shit and take accountability for it in the relationship space. But a big element of this is also learning to like self-soothe. Since we're talking about like, anxiety and relationships, I think a lot of people who struggle with anxious attachment their desire is often to regulate through their partner, right? They want that reassurance. They want that comfort in the relationship. And especially if there's conflicting moments when it comes to the attachment stuff, it's really important to also be able to ground yourself for you and validate your own feelings, because as much as we'd love for a partner to be able to validate us all the time and see everything the way that, we see it, it's not always realistic in relationships. Our stuff can get in the way. So being able to, say, hey, I feel this way, this is my need, and feel valid and strong in that, it's a skill, but it, is a big one, I think, for the anxious side of things.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting because I've seen this through the dating lens now, as like, there's so many people. I think there's a real barrier now in terms of just connecting with people, because people have like like their lists, right? And it's like, I need to find somebody who is like able to deal with this and able to deal with this. So, like, everybody has this like giant list of like, this is what I need from somebody in order to have a successful relationship. When I think in reality, like what you said, you need to be able to take care of yourself first. And until you can do that, I think it's going to be really tricky to like be able to show up fully authentic and fully connected to somebody else, right?
Yeah, it's like hard to bear like all of the messy bits within yourself if you haven't made peace with them yet. And again, that making peace doesn't mean loving all of it, right? And being totally okay with it, but it's more just like allowing yourself to be that version of you. But yeah, dating is very complex nowadays. and I think with like dating apps and everything like that too, it's just, it's complex in terms of like finding someone that deeply resonates with you and knowing which of those like checklist things to prioritize. Yeah. Because some of those I'm sure are very important in terms of like what you value and what you need. But it's like what are the ones that we can kind of make some wiggle room for, Yeah. It's hard to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think communication is such a big piece of that, right? Huge. And like, how can you know if somebody's going to work for you until you start communicating things, right? Totally. But like, I think especially with, for example, like anxious attachment we mentioned, I think that is something that if you have like an awareness of it for yourself and you are able to communicate that, you'll get a lot of information back based off of like how this is going to go. If you're telling somebody like, I'm anxiously attached, like I'm working on it, like I understand this about myself, and like I'm not putting that onto you. However, this is how it might show up in some situations. I want you to be aware of it and know that I know that like I'm aware of it, right? Like that's a pretty powerful statement for somebody to be like if I heard that from somebody, I'd be like, I appreciate that so much that you're like kind of warning me or giving me a heads up about your tendencies.
Totally. And again, I think it's that in that statement, right? There's so much vulnerability and like owning your shit, right? To go to someone and be like, hey, like here are like my quirks, my triggers, the ways that I might show up that might be interesting to navigate, right? And giving somebody the information that they need in order to love you the way that you need to be loved or want to be loved is so, so powerful. And hard to do. I think, again, if we're disconnected from those underlying things that anxiety might be telling us is important for us in a relationship, or whatever it might be, it can be kind of tricky. But communication is like so, so, so huge. And just on that note too, I think especially for anxious attachers, but just dating in general, I think people are really hesitant to like show their cards and have those vulnerable conversations about, needs or boundaries early on in dating. But like, I'm so of the belief system that like, do it off the hop. And like, as you said, you'll see kind of how that person responds and if they're, able or willing to show up for you. But we so often try to like filter through, you know, all of these parts of ourselves when we're dating and show a specific version. But, the truth always comes out. Might as well like do it earlier on,
Yeah. Well, and that's an anxious thing in itself, right? Mm-hmm. That not wanting to be vulnerable, because it's like, especially if you're an anxiously attached person, you're like, oh, if I tell them this, like, are they going to leave? If I tell them this, are they not going to like me as much? If I tell them this, like, what if, right? Yeah. And it circles back to what you said before. You have to have almost like a confidence with that I'm going to be okay no matter what. Mm-hmm. I know for me, that's what it was, because I've been anxiously attached a little bit, and it's something that I'm working on. But by recognizing it and doing the internal work, I've been able to be at a place now where it's like, okay, I recognize that this is kind of like my tendencies based off of X, Y, and Z that have happened in my life. However, I also know that like if somebody doesn't accept that part of me and are willing to work with it, because I know I'd be willing to work with it with somebody, then like I know I'll be good, because it just like wasn't meant to be. Yeah, I often with dating, like I've used this myself, and when helping like clients work through these things, like often when we're anxiously attached, we'll focus more on like, does this person like me, as opposed to, do I like this person, right? We get so focused on like their approval or how we think they perceive us or how they might react, and less on like, hey, does this person standing in front of me like make me feel safe? Like, are they embodying the values that are important for me in a relationship? And often that's like a helpful kind of shift to make in terms of like, is this person showing me the things that I need in order to feel like safe, comfortable, and trusting in the relationship, Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting one to navigate too. And that being said, though, I think also people who are on the more avoidant side of things, like vulnerability is very scary to them, right? That connection piece is often what the trigger is, right? So they'll get a taste of it, they'll show something, and then that's kind of when they pull away. So it's funny, it's so different, but the root fears are very similar often in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too, because those two will often find each other and play off of each other, right? Because that avoidant personality, that avoidant attachment will look for the more anxiously attached, because they kind of fill each other's gaps in a sense, right?
Yeah. And they trigger each other, right? We often are drawn towards triggers that feel similar, like the past loves to repeat itself. And if you maybe grew up experiencing love or connection in a certain way, right, that's what feels familiar. So yeah, we'll often gravitate towards people that, push our buttons, and that's okay. Like, we can work through those things, but it's an interesting one to navigate at times.
It's like, know your limits, stay within it. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, relationships are such a complex thing. Does that play into like friendships and stuff too, do you think?
I think so. I'd say maybe less so maybe than romantic relationships. Like romantic relationships, they more so mirror the attachment that we have with like parents. So they tend to get to those like core wounds a little bit more, and bit of an overgeneralization, but I'd say our self-worth tends to be a bit more caught up in our romantic partners. But it can totally show up with like friends and colleagues and stuff like that as well. Yeah,
I guess like with romantic partners, you're typically getting more into like deeper conversations and stuff like that too. So there's like more need and space for vulnerability, I guess, in terms of like needing to build trust with somebody and those types of things.
Totally. And also just more space for feeling rejected, right? Like when you bare your soul to somebody and like let them see you in all those messy moments, right? That rejection cuts deeper. It's harder to navigate, right, than somebody maybe you don't know as well. Yeah.
So there's almost this idea of like, if I share all of this with this person and then it doesn't work out, now this person has like, it's almost like now they have my like deep dark secrets, right?
Yeah.
It's a scary thing,
totally.
I think, for a lot of people. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who struggle with like the avoidant attachment side of things, they often are really scared about their vulnerabilities like being used against them. And I think this is probably a fear for most people. I don't think that's a fun experience to kind of have. But, I think when you're vulnerable, right, you are giving somebody, you're exposing yourself in a certain way and like giving somebody the opportunity to hurt you, to not show up, right? So often I think we'll be vulnerable, but not like really vulnerable to the core. It'll be kind of a veiled version or protective version of vulnerability, but that true raw, like letting somebody see the like hurt, scared, wounded parts of you, like, yeah, it's very exposing. It's risky.
But there's definite strength to sharing and doing that.
Totally.
I'm curious if you have like a moment in your life or anything like that where it kind of taught you the strength and vulnerability in like having your own vulnerability.
Specific moment. Hey, I think like a big thing, like for me being on like the giving end of the vulnerability, it's being able to express like my feelings and my needs. It's something I've always like really struggled with, and I'd maybe try to get my needs met in like a roundabout way. But I noticed that when I started really asking people directly for what I needed in a grounded way, not necessarily the panicked way that it sometimes wants to come out, I realized it gives people the information that they need to show up for you and to love you, right? And that feels really good when you do that with somebody who can like hold that space. Yeah, and I think just like I very much value like my friendships too. I think not that, you know, male friendships don't hit quite the same, but like female friendships, there can be really emotionally vulnerable and deep. And I think just having some like really awesome friendships in my life has like modeled that for me too, and being able to like, I've been able to transfer that into other relationships, whether it's like work or romantic or whatever. But I also think too, just being in this line of work and seeing people be vulnerable and feeling the power within that, it's kind of intoxicating of like, this is really cool. And I realized too through my work, we are so similar, even if we're very different people with different backgrounds, life experiences, attachment styles, like whatever, like the core pieces that we worry about or that scare us are so similar. And just seeing that, it's like, oh, and we're also scared to like talk to each other, but we're all like feeling very similar things, you know?
Yeah. It's so true. And I see that in like men's groups that I host. I see that even in conversations with people like yourself who I have on the podcast. I've had conversations like off air after we're done recording and stuff with people. And when you really start to talk about it and talk about your life and things, you realize that we're all struggling with our own things. Like we've all, as messed up as you think maybe your situations have been, like the person next to you has a situation that, you know, could probably top it, or like, you know, not that it's a competition, but it's this collective, it's this togetherness. And something you said too that I think is really valuable is having people in your life, like for you having other women who can relate to you, for men having other men as well that they can relate to.
Totally.
I do think that it hits different, you know, and it's just important to have people who can relate in similar ways to you.
Totally. And I think like that experience of being like deeply seen is like really powerful in general, but I think especially for men, right? I just want to have like a big party for a lot of my male clients, because so many will sit there and talk about wanting this type of friendship with their male friends or type of connection. But I think it's more challenging sometimes to find. I find a lot of like men's friendships are based around like activities, like sports, drinking culture sometimes is a big part of male friendships as well. Like, and sitting and just, you know, talking about your feelings, like isn't necessarily as commonplace. So there's sometimes a lot of barriers to like doing that, and that fear of rejection because, you know, be a man or whatever those narratives are that you guys might be kind of faced with. Yeah. And I know sometimes like women have internalized some of that stuff as well. Like I think that's often a soft spot for women that we need to kind of look at too, is like how we create space for men in our lives to be vulnerable with us. And when they are really like treating that as a sacred moment. Yeah.
I find things always come down to like curiosity is such a powerful thing, right? If you can just be curious about like the other person or curious about yourself, you start to learn so much more. And I think through curiosity, empathy can really be born.
Totally. And I sorry, here.
No, go ahead.
I get excited about things. But yeah, I think the hard part is often when we're faced with someone's vulnerability that makes us feel something, shame is just at the forefront, right? So if I was coming to you and giving you feedback about something in a relationship, right? And if your immediate instinct is like, oh, I'm not good enough, or they think I've failed, and then the defenses kind of come up, curiosity does not jive well with those moments, right? To be curious means almost putting yourself aside and putting yourself into someone else's like shoes, perspective, feelings, ways of seeing the world, right? But so often our own self-image or anxiety or whatever gets in the way of that curiosity. And it's like, yeah, but curiosity is such a beautiful word for it. Yeah, just like diving into someone's mind and trying to understand the nuances and like asking the questions you need to understand, not to defend.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love this conversation around vulnerability too, because I think it's so complex, because we know it's important to be vulnerable. We're learning that it's important to be vulnerable, but that like vulnerability in itself is a vulnerability, right? There's a risk to it, but the only way that you can, it's like the only way that if I wanted to see if like you and I had a trusting friendship here, like I could tell you something that's very vulnerable, but that's like kind of the only way that I'm going to know whether or not it's like a test. Like, will she respond in a way that makes me feel safe or not? And that's the true vulnerability.
Yeah.
Right. I've in my life, I've been somebody who's like very openly vulnerable, and to the sense where I've had to learn now, like my therapist and I came up with this term kind of as like vulnerability with boundaries.
Yes.
Where I was like, even on and we see it on social media, right, where people will like blast out their vulnerabilities and stuff, and it's like I've had to learn to do it, like create boundaries around my vulnerability so that I can start to learn like who's safe, because it can have a negative impact if you're being vulnerable too much with people who don't make you feel safe, because then vulnerability has this negative feeling towards it all the time.
Totally. It's like discernment, right? Around like when and where to be vulnerable. And not that people have to earn it, but kind of like, is this person showing me like elements in the relationship that, you know, I want to let those walls down and let them see things? Because yeah, vulnerability inherently is risky, right? It basically is like doing something and just being like, well, we'll see what happens, see what the outcome is, and like letting go of that control, which is again with that anxiety and the control piece there, can be very, very difficult to do. But I think that like over disclosing, or just like, I don't love the term trauma dumping, but that, you know, kind of trauma dumping side of things can often be done in a test like way, right? Which is that truly vulnerability then, right? Just showing yourself as a way of like being seen, as opposed to being attached to like the outcome of the conversation. And
yeah, I feel myself personally, like I've learned to trust my intuition with that now, whereas before it was my mind's kind of jumping, but you said something before actually that made me think about a conversation with my therapist as well, where I remember my therapist asking me, I said to my therapist that, you know, everybody has my trust until they don't. Like I will give everybody my trust, like I'm a very trusting person, and they kind of challenged me on that in the sense of like, why does everybody automatically get your trust? And it made me really rethink that, and that's kind of where I started to turn the tide with that. And I think that a lot of people probably do approach it that way. It's like, yeah, everybody has my trust until they break it. It's like, but does everybody deserve your trust? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that anyways.
Oh, it's like, it's an interesting one. I would say like I'm also quite a trusting person, but I think the hard part is like how attached you are to the outcome of that trust or that vulnerability, right? Like if one thing going wrong, your brain's like, oh, that's proof, like shut him out kind of thing too. Like very like black and white with it. That can be an interesting layer to navigate. I guess a follow-up question for you, like when you say trust, like what does that kind of mean to you in the context of a relationship? Like how would that show up?
Safety, I think, is the word that comes to mind. It would be trust that, honestly, like from like the most ground level, trusting that like if I share something with you that you know is vulnerable to me, that I know that it's not going to get like repeated, would be like a form of trust. Yeah. Right. It'd be like that, like our conversations are safe within each other is a big one. Like I have friendships like that where I just know like I can tell this person something and I have full confidence that they're not going to be like, oh, did you hear what like, you got to hear this thing that Kyle went through. Yeah. Right. To me, that's like kind of ground level trust anyways. And then it builds from there.
Yeah. So I think like if that's like the baseline, that's, you know, a high baseline too, in terms of expecting people, just, you know, average person that you kind of meet to hold this like unconditional, safe, private space like for you. I think, you know, I really like to see the goodness in people. I do believe that inherently humans like are good. I think, you know, shit happens and life happens and can get a little complicated. But I think a big thing too is like, you know, values, right? So a lot of what you just said speaks to the values that you have like in your relationships and probably for yourself, like as a person. But we don't know if everybody sees the world the same way and values the same things in relationships, right? So I think often when we're vulnerable with someone, we want to know, for me, like trust would be knowing that, you know, those kind of core pieces like would line up, so that it would require you to know them and their nuances and the way that they perceive the world a little bit more, right? To know that you're aligned and the vulnerability maybe means the same thing to them as it does to you.
Yeah, the other thing that was on my mind before my mind jumped all over the place, my ADHD brain kicked in. But even in terms of trust and building, like I've started to feel more intuitive in like where I have a feeling with somebody where like I feel like I can share this with them. And it's something I'm not sure I can put words on. And it could just be in like the nuances of like the responses through even small things where maybe there's like a compassion shown where it's like, oh, like I bumped my knee. Oh, like how does it feel? Like, or they check in with you like, how's your knee feeling today? I remember you bumped it yesterday. Like little things like that where it's like you start to get a feeling with somebody, I think. But that's where like, you know, the first time you meet somebody, you're not like telling them all the things that have gone through in your life or telling it to the person at the till or something like that. Yeah. Where it's like, I've learned that for me, like I'm allowed to have my things and like keep them to myself until I feel like I feel that safety with somebody.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think intuition is a really like beautiful thing. And I know for a lot of people navigating anxiety versus intuition, it can be challenging. Sometimes anxiety thinks it's all knowing, right? And it's like, oh, this is what's going to happen, or this is what the situation is. But intuition kind of, even as you described it, it's very gentle and it's sure. It's not panicked or, you know, intense. But I think listening to our intuition is a really, really beautiful thing. But you know, at the end of the day, I believe if you're vulnerable with someone and you give them that trust in that moment, regardless of the outcome, like that's such a beautiful like thing to do. But yeah, again, it's easy to focus on the way that vulnerability is like responded to. But, you know, let's say you go on a date with someone and you open up to them about stuff, or maybe you just admit you really like them or whatever it is, and they don't reciprocate or things don't work out. You know, I wouldn't say that's vulnerability that's lost either. It's just, you know, part of the journey to kind of keep going on your path. But,
it's like all information.
Yes.
Almost. Yeah.
Totally.
It's like, okay, that's the type of person that like when I get that response, now I know that doesn't make me feel safe. So now I know I'm looking for a different type of response. Yeah,
totally. And I think if we all just could walk around with a little bit more like openness and vulnerability, like in our relationships, it would probably mean, yes, some more hard or uncomfortable conversations, or maybe feelings of rejection or whatever challenges kind of arise. But I think we would all have so much more space to have more of that meaningful connection and community that we were kind of talking about earlier. So I'd rather be too trusting than closed off in general. You know, it's just a matter of, again, building that safety within yourself to work through those experiences if they aren't comfortable per se, or, you know, leave you with some like lingering stuff. Cause that happens.
No, I agree 100% with that. I would much rather be a trusting person and more open and willing to create more connections in that way than to be super closed off and like nobody's going to know my story. Nobody's going to, Yeah.
It's just, again, that self-compassion piece, being really gentle to yourself too, and being like, you know, I like opened myself up to the potential of something, you know, I was honest, I was raw, like that's, you know, a beautiful thing. But, you know, back to kind of what you were saying about your therapy session, like there definitely also is a level of wanting to, again, have that relationship with yourself be at the forefront and make sure that you're taking care of yourself in terms of like how you're approaching things and the access, I guess, that maybe you give people to you.
Yeah, and it's great because it sounds like, you know, that anxiety piece that we started talking about, it plays so much into the relationship piece as well, right? If you're letting that anxiety, if it's controlling your thoughts and your behaviors, it's going to be really hard to allow yourself to even be present and vulnerable and authentic with a friend or a romantic partner or your business colleagues or anything.
Yeah. And anxiety, like, it's really about fear, right? It's like, what are you, you know, afraid of? What is your mind trying to like escape through, like, you know, the anxious thought patterns that we kind of go on? And fear, once we kind of can tie down what we're afraid of, it's sometimes a little bit easier to be like compassionate towards that piece, because it's so human, right? Like being scared of whether it's like rejection, judgment, being emotionally abandoned, whatever it might be. Like these are those core experiences that we like share as people. But yeah, anxiety, it's a real bitch. It can keep us kind of closed off and have a hard time taking those risks. But so many of the good things in life are on the other side of our comfort zone.
So what are some of the kind of simple things that somebody can do? Somebody who's listening to this episode right now and they're like, maybe I do have anxiety. Like I do recognize that it's controlling a lot of the interactions in my life and maybe holding me back a little bit. What are some simple things people can do to start to kind of tame that anxiety or take the control back?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so I'll give a couple examples. So I think thought-wise, like kind of getting off autopilot and breaking down like those narratives that you get really stuck in. I'm a huge fan of versions of journaling, I always say. So like whether it be like having a note in your phone that you can kind of brain dump stuff, journal prompts that'll kind of guide you to reflect on like, hey, like where did this start today? Like what was I telling myself? Just to kind of, help you understand what this like narrative is that you're really hooked into, can help process it. Obviously the more kind of somatic based regulation stuff is really important, like mindfulness, insert mindfulness comment by every therapist, but just being able to kind of come back into the present moment, because anxiety is all like in your head, usually future or past, but often future kind of oriented. And as much as we can like try to look at anxiety and fix it and regulate it, a huge part of getting through it is being able to separate yourself from it and come back into like the present moment. And that could be like working through the anxiety still, but it also could just be like, hey, I'm gonna like go outside and remember that like nature exists, or like talk to someone.
It's like the anxiety is not me, the anxiety is separate.
Yeah,
and finding that separation sounds like a big piece.
Totally. And I think the hard part is often like when anxiety like wins per se, right, is what we'll end up doing is we're prioritizing what feels good in the short term, usually that like relief of that fear or that anxiety that's there, but it's not leading us towards what it is that we really truly wanted, the big picture of things. Versus, when we're doing the hard thing, it often is uncomfortable in the short term, like whether it's like public speaking or having a hard conversation, but in the end, it's taking us more towards that like type of relationship that we want, or the type of person that we want to be. So with working through anxiety, a lot of it is like finding those ways to like make sense of what's happening for yourself, regulate it kind of within your body, nervous system, that sort of thing. And then building up the capacity to do the damn hard thing, right? Because the more that we let that short-term comfort win, the more distant we get from like the things that we really want. So I always say like pick your hard, right? Like we can pick the hard of like doing the easy thing now, but then being stuck in this pattern, or maybe problems aren't addressed or whatever. Or we can pick the hard of doing the comfortable thing now and then, kind of reap the benefits. But the more you do that, the more you do the hard thing that's like bigger picture kind of focused, it helps your brain kind of regulate through that anxiety and trust itself a little bit. Cause it's like, oh, I did the hard thing and like, I didn't get in trouble, or, they didn't get mad at me, or that I actually got my needs met a little bit more, or I learned a new thing, or whatever it is. Right.
Yeah.
And just through that experience, it'll kind of help rewire our brain a little bit to start perceiving things differently, I guess. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, you gotta do the hard thing. And it never ends up as bad as our anxiety typically makes us think it's going to.
Absolutely not. Anxiety loves a good spiral. Loves to ruminate.
It does. Okay, I have a fun thing. So I finish every episode. My last guest wrote a question.
Okay.
And I haven't read it yet, so I'm going to read that question and give it to you.
Okay, cool.
And then I'll give you the opportunity to do the same thing after.
Cool. I love that.
My next guest. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so this is a two-part question, it looks like. So, the first thing, if you could meet one person dead or alive and spend time with them, who would it be?
Oh, interesting question. I've thought about this question so much. I feel like this is like a dinner party question. And I'm like, I have like no fixation on like history and stuff. So I'm like, I'd love to have this like really cool answer right now. Dead or alive, though. I guess they could be present. Pause for me. Thinking. Can it be, and my expectation with this question is it would be like a very candid, like vulnerable kind of conversation. Yeah. Potentially.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh God, I have no idea honestly what I'd say to this. Honestly, you know what? I'm just gonna go with an answer of someone that I like think is really cool. There's a writer that I really like. His name's Young Pablo. He writes.
Love
Do you
him.
know him?
Yeah.
I love him. I'm obsessed. I have a tattoo.
I've got
of one
so
of his
many of
quotes.
his books. Yeah.
They're so good, and I just like think his way of like seeing the world and articulating things is just like I feel very like aligned with it, and like I love writing. That's kind of one of my long-term goals is to write a book similar form to his. And I just think his mind is like beautiful. I've watched so many YouTube videos of him chatting, and I just think, yeah, it'd be a really like insightful conversation.
Yeah.
I just find him fascinating. So yeah, that was kind of my first
Okay,
instinct.
I love it. So part 2 of that question,
Okay.
how do you believe you could impact them, and in what ways?
I mean, I think just like appreciation for art, I think is something that is always like nice to receive. I think when you can tell like with his writing, he puts his like heart into it, and he speaks from experience in some capacity, I would say. And I just think any moment where somebody again is vulnerable, right, in those sorts of ways, like feeling like that experience is seen and valued and acknowledged by someone, like is great. I wouldn't say, you know, that he has never had these sorts of things happen. I'm sure he gets it a lot because he's incredible, but I don't want to like diminish the weight of that too, of just like speaking with someone who you've like deeply impacted and like having that acknowledged. I have this like saying that I've like operated on for the last like, I don't know, probably like 8 or 9 years. It's like, if you think something nice, always say it to someone. It makes a bigger difference than you realize. So simple answer, but yeah.
I love it. That's awesome. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. I thank you for being here. This has been so fun. Such a great conversation.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. This is absolutely lovely.
Yeah, no, it was an absolute pleasure, and we'll have to do it again because I think there's so much more we could have gotten into. It's like an hour goes by so fast.
I know, two ADHD brains being like, let's think of all
this,
the tangents.
Yeah,
I love it.
No, so thanks again. I really appreciate it, and thanks to everybody for listening and watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.